Okay, this is the second part of Stephen Lee's essay about the impact of the changes made by the Nazis on mass media and culture. The first podcast looked at the impact on mass media, radio, cinema and the press. This one now focuses in on literature, art and music. And as Lee points out in the introduction, contact with the public was less constant and less direct. So in terms of impact on popular opinion, not as significant as the mass media outlets that we looked at previously, but nevertheless important. So let's just jump straight to that section of the essay. Okay, so part 2, culture. Go through the points one by one. Lee starts off by emphasising the sort of rather ambivalent Nazi attitude. We keep using that sort of word contradictions, where the Nazis were often caught in a sort of contradictory stance. And this is very true with their attitude towards culture. On the one hand, they were very distrustful of some of the traditional content, as we'll see. On the other hand, they never quite succeeded in providing an alternative culture. So effectively, censorship eradicated much of the pre-1933 culture because the Nazis disapproved of it, but they were never able to really replace it with a true alternative. So what it did is it created a vacuum, a hole in the heart of culture, which is a sort of general theme that you'll see as we go through this. Let's focus in on the different areas then. First of all, literature. Okay, focus on literature was very much preventive censorship. And more than any other aspect of culture, this is where you get this idea of a vacuum, of a complete void. To some extent, the other areas, which we'll look at in a minute, the Nazis, in particular with art, did manage to provide something to fill it with. But with literature, they never really came up with an alternative form of literature. Okay, so all literary activity from the Weimar Republic and earlier was subject to the scrutiny of the Reich Chamber of Literature. So there were 2,500 publishing houses and 23,000 bookshops, all privately owned. The Nazis fully realised that there was no way they could coordinate by simply taking them over, so their main method of Gleichschaltung was to subject them to scrutiny and censorship. Now, the immediate impact: 2,500 German authors were placed on a list of banned books. That included all Jewish writers. Ossietzky is an example. It's always useful to be able to give examples if you want to talk about this in the exam. Libraries were ransacked by students, and of course, very famously, on the 10th of May 1933, there was the massive book burning sessions by students, the Nazi League of Students and the SA, across the whole of the country. How were those gaps filled? Well, there were some pro-Nazi writers. An example is Hans Grimm, who wrote a very long novel called, real eye-catcher this one, People Without Living Space. Okay, so it's an example of a Nazi novel. In terms of impact, literary poverty. Effectively, the Nazis were never able to fill that gap with anything that was interesting or of lasting cultural value. Hardly surprising, because Nazism is effectively anti-intellectual. Why? Because Nazi discourages diversity of viewpoints. Okay, there's only one point of view. There was only one point of view in the Nazi regime. Individual experience was frowned upon. In order to control popular opinion, the Nazis wanted experiences to be collective and stereotyped. So group outings through strength through joy, etc., etc. leaving people by themselves to be creative by themselves was completely discouraged. So therefore, it's hardly surprising that the Nazi regime, 1933 to 45, failed to produce any lasting literary works. It's unlikely that the population would have been given the time to read official literature, even if the Nazis had been capable of creating it, which they weren't. And in effect, the Nazis gave up on literature as a form of propaganda. The regime simply could not produce anything that was lasting. So the regime was anti-literature. Art. In contrast to literature, the Nazis made a more deliberate effort to try to fill that void. Okay, so as with literature, there was censorship that got rid of paintings and forms of fine art that the Nazis disapproved of, but to some extent they did fill that void with their own artistic work. So let's have a look at that. Okay, now clearly art was used as a medium to promote blood and soil ideas. So first of all, the censorship. Weimar artists and paintings were censored. Okay, so experimental trends, and there were lots of them from the Weimar era or earlier, such as expressionism and dadaism, were ended. All forms of modern art were labelled as being degenerate. Okay, often crudely labelled as being socialist or communist or international, sort of undermining the sort of blood and soil ideals of which were very traditional, sort of values based on good peasant values and based on the home and so on and so forth. So the modern art was very much frowned upon. So there's the Reich Chamber. This one was called the Reich Chamber of Visual Arts, led by a Nazi called Ziegler. 42,000 artists had to be registered, and you could only sell paintings with a permit given to you by the Reich Chamber of Visual Arts. And the Nazis throughout the period used propaganda to educate Germans about what was acceptable and unacceptable. Very interestingly, unlike literature where they just burned books, what the Nazis did with degenerate art is they actually gathered it all together and opened an exhibition in Munich, Dortmund and Cologne. And there was an exhibition of the degenerate, the unacceptable art. It was put on display. And then they also obviously opened official exhibits of approved art in the German Art Exhibition, which was held in Munich between 1937 and 1944. So what were the objectives? The purpose was to remove abstract influences, anything abstract, so Dadaism, Expressionism. And what the Nazis want to do is create a new sense of order that would reflect the people's community. So typical Nazi art presented pictorial stereotypes of people of racial appearance. Nothing modern like Picasso, it was all very traditional. Women shown to be mothers and home-minders, men in various militaristic roles, and so Nazi paintings reinforced the values that were being imparted to children through schools and through youth organisations. Now, did this work? Art became bland, lacking in any obvious talent. Heard that before, okay? We said the same with mass media. The cinema became bland. It's just popular escapist entertainment. The newspapers, people stopped reading them. Literature, there was nothing to read. Much of Nazi art was very derivative. Okay, that they did produce paintings, but it was very much sort of like just copying the earlier classical masters, the sort of same styles, for example, used by Rubens. That can be seen in a famous Nazi painting called Venus and Adonis by a Nazi painter called Kampf. So Nazi paintings were very bland, really. They just copied the old masters, had little impact on the public, most of whom were more interested in the exhibitions of degenerate art. So when the Nazis put on these degenerate art exhibitions that were referenced earlier, But flocks of people went to those. They found them really interesting. But the attendance at the official German art exhibition was not well attended. Music, okay, is the next one. Unacceptable musicians and pieces of music were censored. So, no surprise, the Reich Chamber of Music, anything experimental from before 1933, and there was a great deal of it, a sort of atonal music, very modern music, experimental, was automatically labelled as being degenerate and un-German. So, some great musicians, experimental musicians, Schoenberg and Hindemith, were simply banned. From 1937, all new productions in music required the approval of the censorship reading panel, and all Jewish composers and musicians were banned. Popular trends such as American jazz and swing were deplored as being corrupting and a cancerous growth, not least because a lot of that music was, of course, written by and performed by American blacks, who were obviously seen to be a racial inferior group. In contrast to art or literature, though, many musicians and pieces of music escaped censorship. The majority of German or Austrian composers, classical composers, were, of course, a part of Germany's cultural heritage. Sort of Beethoven and Mozart and so on, of course, they escaped censorship. Many contemporary composers, modern composers, e.g. Richard Strauss and Karl Orff, actually did manage to coexist with the regime, in spite of the fact their music was very modern. So the actual president of the Reich Chamber of Music until 1935 was Richard Strauss. But most famously, of course, the Nazis used prominent 19th century German composers to promote their Völkisch values, especially Richard Wagner, who was one of the great 19th century composers of operas, and his famous The Ring cycle of operas. The storyline of those operas were about sort of heroic, historic settings in which with very sort of heroic German figures, of course, could be used to promote Völkisch values about sort of man and Superman and so on and so forth. So they were very much promoted by Hitler, and Hitler every year went to Beirut, which was the home of Wagner, to visit his widow. He went to visit her every year. Even some popular trends such as jazz survived. Goebbels was smart enough to understand that completely banning anything modern would impact on civilian morale. So sort of some jazz did slip through. Assessment. There were numerous instances of antisocial behaviour by swing youth. Okay, so banned music was listened to by young people. On the whole, Nazi output was more eclectic and less monolithic than with writers and artists. What that basically is saying is that in the end, a lot of music did slip through, it escaped censorship, it was allowed to exist. And so there was a variety of music for people to listen to, certainly in comparison to literature, where much was just simply completely banned, and art, as we've seen, where it was all very bland and uniform. So as a result, the musical output of Nazi Germany was superior than in other cultural spheres. But the result of that then was music was distinctly less Nazi. Okay, so by means of a conclusion, traditionally historians have defined Nazi culture as being Nazis as being Philistines. Okay, of course there's plenty of evidence of that. There's very little of substance. I mean, you can't really think of any sort of Nazi culture that has survived and is sort of like looked upon highly, a century later. The reality, though, is much more complex. The Nazis were very pragmatic in their approach, which meant that many links with the past were permitted. So, for example, Wagner was allowed to continue as popular music. Certain aspects of American music was allowed. And even the degenerate influences were not entirely eliminated. Now, the cumulative effect was to lower rather than raise the sum of Germany's cultural parts, which is a nice little quote there. For example, there was no there was no real Nazi equivalent to the achievements of the communist regime in the Soviet Union. So, across the border in the Soviet Union, there was a totalitarian dictatorship that actually created a formidable alternative Russian culture, especially in music like Stravinsky. The Soviet Union, although the regime has now gone, the culture of the Soviet Union has lasted, whereas that was not true with the Nazi regime. When the regime went, the culture went with it, because the culture really was not long-lasting. Second conclusion, throughout the Nazi era there were two levels of propaganda. At one level put across Hitler's basic ideology. Okay, the other level made pragmatic adjustments to fit the needs of the moment. Okay, so sort of two levels. These two levels worked in different ways according to different times. So during the period 1933 to 39, you tend to have pragmatism diluting ideology. Okay, so that created inconsistency in the ways that Hitler's ideas were delivered. So, for example, a good example of this, Hitler, of course, in the 30s was presented as a man of peace. Yet, mass media and culture, of course, promoted the values of struggle and war. So you've got that basic contradiction in the 1930s. Now, obviously, during the period 39 to 45, Germany was at war. So therefore, the ideology that was being put through in propaganda was more aligned to the reality, because Germany was at war. Okay, so therefore the inconsistencies were ironed out during World War II, and that can be seen in two stages. Firstly, people became acclimatised to the idea of war, particularly in the early period. So propaganda, of course, was promoting war, and the war was going well. Now, after 1943, the war was not going well, it was turning against Germany, so propaganda instead focused on developing fortitude in the face of adversity. In other words, it focused on the experience of war. We need to fight to the end, and so on. Okay, so sorry, that's the end of it. I was just going to the next page to see what was on page 6, but there is no page 6. Okay, so hopefully that was useful to you. I've gone over the 15 minutes, so I'll upload this to YouTube for you now. Thank you.